There's one read of all this that I think is the correct one, and it is not the obvious one. But I'm not going to hand it to you yet, because there are two more things you need to see first, and they're the two things that changed my mind. If that sounds like a strange place to begin, it is, because the title you're about to hear is more aggressive than the confirmed facts actually allow. The U.S. military did not, on July 26th, publicly announce a new strike that day against a specific Iranian maritime target. What happened instead was more complicated. The United States paused its bombing campaign. Iran said it would halt attacks as long as that American pause continued. And yet the Strait of Hormuz remained the central pressure point in the entire confrontation. So today, we're breaking down what the U.S. military actually did around Iran's maritime pressure point, why the title still captures a real strategic story, and why the most important American move may have been the one that looked least aggressive. I'm using what Reuters, AP, Axios, Tasnim, CENTCOM records, and other reporting have actually confirmed. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the U.S. campaign lasted 13 consecutive nights, why the Strait has remained under extreme pressure despite the pause, why Iran's own Tasnim news agency says there has been no change in the status of navigation through the Strait, and why I think the American pause may be less a sign of weakness than a recognition that military pressure has reached the point where maritime control and diplomacy have become inseparable, which I'm going to walk you through at the very end. There's a lot of loud talk online about the U.S. military having just launched another massive attack on Iran's maritime infrastructure. That is not what the reporting supports. Independent reporting says the United States paused its strikes. Iran's own state-linked media has simultaneously reported technical talks with Oman over safe shipping. So let's get into it, sourced step by step. The reason this matters starts with geography. Look at the map for a second. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another piece of water. It is the narrow maritime gateway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. For decades, it has carried a huge share of the world's energy trade. CENTCOM previously described the waterway as an essential international trade corridor. In a May 2026 statement, CENTCOM said about 1/4 of the world's oil trade at sea moves through the strait. That is an enormous strategic number, and it explains why the fight around Iran has never been limited to aircraft and missiles. The maritime battlefield affects energy. It affects insurance, it affects commercial shipping, and it affects every government that depends on predictable fuel supplies. The crisis has already pushed Brent crude above $100 a barrel, according to Reuters reporting on July the 26th. That is not a minor market reaction. It is a signal that the conflict has moved from a regional military confrontation into a global economic problem. Now consider the American military footprint. CENTCOM said in May that its Project Freedom support included guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land-based and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and approximately 15,000 service members. Those figures show the scale of the force positioned around the maritime problem. But scale does not automatically equal control, and that distinction is becoming increasingly important. The United States can deploy aircraft. It can deploy destroyers. It can protect individual ships. It can strike military infrastructure, but reopening a contested waterway is a different problem that requires sustained surveillance, mine detection, air defense, maritime escort, rules of engagement, and political decisions about how far the United States is willing to escalate. Now watch the timeline here. According to AP, the current pause followed weeks of fighting that began after Iran targeted ships in and around the Strait of Hormuz. The United States responded with strikes against Iranian infrastructure. The conflict then entered a cycle of action and retaliation. By July 24th, the United States had suspended its airstrikes after 13 consecutive nights of bombardment. That number matters. 13 nights is long enough for military planners to learn something about the limits of a campaign. And according to Reuters, the pause was connected to President Trump's decision to give diplomacy more room. Iran then indicated that it would also halt attacks for as long as the American pause continued. That does not mean the conflict is over. It means both sides have temporarily stepped back from the most dangerous part of the escalation ladder. Now look at the maritime picture. Iran and Oman held several rounds of technical talks about the strait. That comes directly from Iran's own Tasnim news agency. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baqai said the discussions focused on principles and operational mechanisms for safe shipping. He also said the talks had made progress. But here is the important part. Tasnim reported Baqai saying, "There has been no change in the status of navigation through the strait." That is the adversary's own media acknowledging that the underlying maritime problem remains unresolved. So when you hear someone say the crisis is finished because the bombs stopped, that is missing the central point. The bombs may have paused, the maritime dispute has not. And this is where the title needs careful interpretation. The phrase, just unleashed, describes the strategic pressure surrounding the maritime choke point. It does not describe a newly announced July 26th U.S. strike. That distinction matters. According to Axios, Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of CENTCOM, recommended halting the bombing campaign around the strait because of concerns about diminishing effectiveness. That is a remarkable detail, because it suggests that the U.S. military was not simply asking whether it could continue striking. It was asking whether continuing to strike was actually producing the strategic result Washington wanted. Those are two very different questions, and they lead us directly to the central problem. If the objective is to restore maritime movement, destroying additional targets from the air may not be enough. You need ships to move. You need commercial operators to believe they can move safely. You need insurers to price the risk. You need Iran to accept the arrangement. And you need regional governments to cooperate. This is why the strait has become the pressure point. It is where military power meets economics. It is where diplomacy meets naval operations. And it is where the limits of air power become visible. If you want the real story instead of whatever exaggerated headline is trending this week, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I'm going to keep tracking this one specifically. The next update might be the one where the tension around the strait actually breaks. Now let's look at the strategic machinery underneath all of this. The first constraint is geography. The strait is narrow. That creates opportunities for disruption that are difficult to solve with air power alone. The second constraint is escalation. Every additional American strike creates a potential Iranian response, and Iran does not need to defeat the entire U.S. military to create economic damage. It only needs to make maritime activity uncertain enough that commercial operators hesitate. That is a much lower threshold. The third constraint is time. The United States can sustain a major military operation, but the longer the maritime disruption continues, the more pressure builds on energy markets and global supply chains. The fourth constraint is the missile defense problem. Reuters reported that concerns had been raised inside the administration about dwindling U.S. missile defense stockpiles. Axios separately reported that General Dan Kane warned Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and President Trump about shortages of air defense interceptors. If accurate, those warnings reveal the hidden cost of a long campaign. A military can have enough aircraft to strike. That does not mean it has unlimited defensive ammunition to protect every base, ship, and partner. And that changes the calculation. Iran also faces constraints. It cannot assume that maritime disruption will remain cost-free. The United States has already demonstrated its willingness to use military force. Regional governments have their own interests, and Iran's economy remains exposed to the consequences of prolonged disruption. So both sides have reasons to pressure the other. Both sides also have reasons to avoid crossing certain lines. That's the machinery. But there is one read of all this that I think is the correct one, and it is not the obvious one. But I'm not going to hand it to you yet, because there are two more things you need to see first. And they're the two things that changed my mind. Quick gut check. Drop a comment right now with just the single word pressure. If you think the U.S. pause is part of a deliberate strategy to force Iran toward a maritime compromise, or reset if you think the pause mainly reflects the limits of the military campaign. I genuinely want to see where this audience lands before I give you my own read at the end of this video. Now let's examine one concrete case. In May, CENTCOM said U.S. forces protected American warships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The ships named in the official account were USS Truxtun, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Mason. According to CENTCOM, Iranian forces launched missiles, drones, and small boats during that transit. CENTCOM said no U.S. assets were struck. The American response, according to the same statement, included strikes against Iranian military facilities associated with the attacks. Those targets included missile and drone launch sites. They also included command and control locations, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance nodes. That is important because it shows how the United States has approached the maritime problem. The strategy has not simply been to attack ships. It has been to target the military architecture that makes maritime pressure possible. Launch sites, command networks, surveillance systems, and coastal infrastructure. That is the first of the two things I mentioned. The second is what happens when you move from the military map to the human reality. Forget the maps for 90 seconds. You're a night shift engineer near a commercial port in the Gulf of Oman. It's late and the air is warm against your face. You can see the lights of vessels in the distance. Some are moving, some are waiting. The water looks calm from where you stand, but the atmosphere does not feel calm. You hear machinery running behind you. You hear voices from workers nearby. You check your phone. You look toward the water again. You wait for instructions. You know that every vessel has to make decisions before it moves. You know that crews need clearance. You know that a ship can be physically capable of sailing, while the people responsible for it still decide that the risk is too high. You listen for the next update. You watch the horizon. You wait. And then you go back to work, because the machinery around you does not stop simply because governments are negotiating. That's the layer underneath every number I just gave you. And it's the second thing that changed how I read this. I want to be clear that this next part is my opinion, not reported fact. My read is that the U.S. pause is best understood, not as surrendering the maritime pressure point, but as recognizing that the next phase cannot be won by bombing alone. Run it forward. If the United States continues striking indefinitely, then Iran has an incentive to keep the maritime confrontation alive. If Iran keeps the strait under pressure, then shipping costs rise. If shipping costs rise, energy prices rise. If energy prices rise, political pressure spreads beyond the battlefield, and suddenly the original military objective becomes harder to achieve. That means the most powerful American move may be to keep the military option available while shifting the center of gravity toward maritime negotiations. The countercase is that the pause simply reflects exhaustion, ammunition concerns, or political hesitation. Here's why I don't fully buy it. The United States still has a large military presence in the region. The pause is temporary. And diplomacy is happening at precisely the point where military pressure has created maximum incentive for both sides to negotiate. That combination looks less like abandonment and more like recalibration. The key is that the U.S. does not necessarily need to destroy the strait to control the strategic outcome. It needs to influence whether Iran can keep the strait effectively closed. Those are different objectives, and the second is much more achievable through a mixture of military pressure, naval presence, economic leverage, and diplomacy. If you want deep dives like this, the moment new information actually gets confirmed, share this with one person who's been confused by the louder, less careful takes floating around. So let's bring everything together. First, the United States did not announce a new July 26 strike that destroyed a specific Iranian maritime facility. That is the first fact you need to keep. Second, according to Reuters and AP, the United States paused its bombing campaign after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. Third, Iran indicated through a senior official that it would halt attacks as long as the American pause continued. Fourth, Iran and Oman conducted technical discussions about safe shipping through the strait, according to Iran's own Tasnim news agency. And fifth, the maritime situation itself remained unresolved. Tasnim reported that there had been no change in the status of navigation through the strait. So what was actually unleashed? Not a new strike on July 26th. The real pressure was the combined weight of the American military presence, the threat of renewed force, the economic consequences of disrupted shipping, and the diplomatic effort to determine who controls the conditions for maritime movement. That is why the title requires an honest resolution. The reporting does not support saying that the U.S. military just destroyed a new Iranian maritime target on July 26th. It does support saying that the United States has maintained intense pressure around Iran's maritime strategy while using a temporary military pause to create space for negotiations. And that distinction is the entire story. Because the central question is no longer simply whether the United States can strike Iran. It is whether military pressure can force a change in Iran's behavior without producing a larger regional confrontation. My answer is that the next stage will be decided at sea as much as in the air. So if you commented pressure, ask yourself whether the evidence changed your mind. And if you commented reset, ask whether the continuing military posture changes your view. Because the pause is temporary, the maritime dispute is unresolved, and the next confirmed move could tell us whether this was the beginning of de-escalation or simply the quietest moment before the next confrontation.